Thank you for joining us for the first session. This forum is organized together by the City of Vancouver and UBC Instruct. And through a total of 6 panel discussions, spanning across today and tomorrow, we'll hope to explore a diverse topic of relevant discussion pieces for Chinatown today as well as the future. But before we go into any further detail, we want to begin today by first acknowledging that today's forum is held on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We thank them for having cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial. And for those of you who are Zooming in from other places, we hope you can take a moment today to acknowledge the lands of the Indigenous peoples of those lands as well. So before we go on any further, I'll pass it on to Vincent Kwan from CTT for some more housekeeping notes.
Thank you, Tyler. Yes, I'll go through just a few housekeeping matters. First and foremost, as audience, you should have the options to turn on the live caption function as Zoom. If you have problems finding the Zoom buttons or the caption buttons, please send us a comment or questions in the Zoom chat so that our tech team can help you with that. As well as we for today's sessions, and actually for all the sessions in the forum, we'll be providing simultaneous interpretations for Mandarin. And to receive interpretation, you can select the button also as Zoom. There should be a button where you can select the channels for the interpretation. These sessions and all the sessions in the forum is designed to be interactive. What that means is that we hope the audience can feel motivated to pose questions to the panel. In order for you to pose the questions, all you have to do is really to go to the special link that is shown in the slide here under slido.com, under Slido. And I think Tyler has also shown in the Zoom chat the specific link where you as audience can post your questions. Because we anticipate a lot of good questions from the panel, we hope this way of using Slido to collect the questions will make our lives a lot easier as well. And now just sort of a reminder, if you have any questions related to for the panel related to this session, please post it onto Slido, not on Zoom. Any questions that you post on Zoom will only be passed to our tech team, who will help you with the technical questions only. Lastly, please continue to visit Chinatown Reimagined.ca, the website for the forum. If you haven't seen it yet, there is a wonderful online exhibition that is now launched as part of the website, as part of the project. Please check it out, and please share it with your friends and colleagues and people who you know will be interested in the work of Chinatown and in the conversation. We hope more people can join this event and be part of reimagining Chinatown. So without further delay, let's start the first session, titled Historic Urban Landscape, Tangible and Intangible Heritage. And with that, I will pass the mic to the session moderator, John Atkin. John.
Great. Thank you, Vincent, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure and with some trepidation that I agreed to host and moderate this session because we have some extraordinarily wonderful presenters this morning. And I think one of the focuses that I'm very pleased to see in this Chinatown Reimagined piece is this, excuse me, this idea of tangible and intangible heritage. So much of heritage practice in the past has been about the physical building, saving that relic, but not understanding the context of the building in terms of what activities might have taken place or do take place in those buildings, which then contribute to what we would call a cultural landscape, of which Chinatown very much is, about the people that live here and work here, but the cultural practice that takes place within the society buildings, for instance, and that impact on the neighborhood. And I think when we look at just merely the physical and we lose some of that intangible, part of the soul of a place leaves. And so I think the presenters today have each got an interesting perspective on this idea. And I'm very pleased to be able to host and moderate this session. So we have, to start off with, 10-minute presentations from our four panelists. And what I want to do right now is just take a short piece out of each of their biographies so that you know who we're listening to today. And they're in order of the presentations that we are presenting. And so our first presenter will be Barry Mcginn. And Barry is a conservation architect and engineer, holds a Master of Science in Historic Preservation from the University of Oregon. And he's been practicing for the last 28 years, and that's been a focus on building conservation and rehabilitation. And if you walk around downtown Vancouver, you stumble across Barry's projects everywhere. And one of the key things was he was a team member of the Chinatown Legacy projects in 2016, and he's the architect of record for the Ma Society building, which is a stunning restoration of a building. And the most recent one is the Lim Se Hor Mok Benevolent Society building on Carroll Street, which is the oldest standing balcony building in Chinatown. And so we're very pleased to have Barry as our first presenter. And Barry, take it away. You're on mute.
Thanks a lot, John. And my presentation will be quite brief as required. So the things I want to talk about, as John mentioned, I was part of the Chinatown Society Legacy Report under James Weldon, and also Jessica Chen, one of our panelists, was a member as well. So that was an important piece of consultancy and help kind of guide, provide some guidance for Chinatown. So I want to touch on that. As John mentioned, I've been involved in several society building rehabilitations. And so I wanted to focus on some aspects of one of those, the Lim Se Hor Khao Mok Benevolent Society rehabilitation. I want to touch on rehabilitation challenges that have kind of, I've identified through my work, some of the funding challenges that have been kind of core to my projects and I think in general. And then just comment briefly on where I think it's all going if we don't provide some worthwhile intervention. Next. Next slide. Oh, good. So this was a study of the 12 society buildings, and initially the real focus was to assess the conditions and identify the upgrades that were required. And it was pretty thorough. We had lots of interaction with all of the societies as we went through this study. And we identified all the upgrades. And generally speaking, we found that the conditions were substandard throughout all the buildings. They all needed, some needed substantially more upgrade than others, but in general, the conditions were substandard. The envelope and building systems needed attention, in some cases fairly urgent attention. So we identified all these aspects and wrapped them into a report. We also had members of the team identify financial tools and other approaches that could be a benefit to the societies in trying to generate larger kind of rehabilitation schemes, and also developed what we thought were worthwhile communication strategies. These are somewhat older photos, both the Ma and at 137 East Pender and Lim Sehor at 525 Carroll have been quite successfully rehabilitated. So that's 2 out of the 12 that have seen some significant worthwhile upgrade. And there's many more to go. Next. So it's been asked why focus on these society buildings, and they are the key. Could be considered the key anchor buildings throughout Chinatown. They are in generally good condition, and they were fairly substantial and continue to be important elements on the street walls and in the streets they occupy. They are active society buildings. They satisfy a pretty important current value in terms of providing a seat for the societies, performing arts and cultural meeting place, and really are to quite an extent the cultural heart of Chinatown. And historically, they're important that they were the significant providers of cultural, social, and housing services to the clans before Canada really recognized the Chinese as citizens, and essentially they had to pull together and look after their own affairs. And that's why it's an important link to their kind of challenging and slow integration into Canadian society. Next. So one of our study really identified some of the key challenges or impediments as to what were kind of holding things back. And essentially, as social service providers, these societies don't generate revenue. And it's not their focus. Their focus is on providing services to their group and to the public at large, so they have a diminished capacity to undertake upgrades. They're an aging demographic. They're actively looking for younger members, but for the most part, their average age is, I think, in the range of 67. And, you know, at that age, I think we're all a bit reluctant to finance any kind of upgrades to our own buildings or buildings we might hold in a collective. So there's that mindset that's a little bit difficult to get past. There's limited access to outside funding and granting sources. They generally need assistance to kind of try to identify outside funding sources and whatnot. The other big deal is the current Vancouver building bylaw, building code triggers inhibit change of use and renovation options through kind of a trigger mechanism. If you undertake enough, for instance, multi-floor renovations, you're triggering kind of upgrades, for instance, anchoring outside building envelope elements that could fall on exit ways and whatnot. It's actually very expensive exercise. With these mass timber buildings, you're having to look at steel framing systems anchored to the masonry, anchored to the floor systems. It's invasive, it's expensive, and that's just at the lower tier of upgrade at a major renovation. If you try to change use in these buildings, which tend to be kind of small floor plate, any more than one level of change is driving you to really a prohibitively expensive seismic upgrade. So those are big impediments to moving forward with any kind of meaningful or substantial change to the buildings. Next. So the key takeaways: building conservation not only protects the key resources which define the character of the area, but also preserves the history, culture, and identity of past and current communities. Most of the society buildings are in decline and need significant funding for necessary upgrades. As I mentioned, they fall into a category that we would call substandard. And urban renewal, building revitalization is an important promoter of healthy communities. Next. Funding for the societies is a chronic problem. I have essentially found this with all of my projects, including the current project with Chen It's a problem, and it is one of the major impediments to moving things ahead. In general, the development must be carefully managed throughout the area to preserve the character while introducing innovative revitalization. And all parties need to participate in the process. You can't really leave any of the stakeholders out. There has to be a really all-inclusive planning process to so that everyone's interests are taken into account. Next. So this is the finished product, Lim Sehor Kalmak Benevolent Society Rehab. Most of our focus was on the rehabilitation on the roof and followed us indoors a little bit. So we have restored the building back to its original character. In the process, we stumbled on all kinds of corroding and difficult hidden conditions, on challenges to bracing the upper parapet wall, to challenges to finding appropriate skill sets to actually accomplish the work. And of course, just working with assisting the group to find money. In this case, we were lucky. We used the city's matching grant system to qualify for a sizable federal grant. Which...
我们获得这样的资金之后呢，这样的经费之后，咦
？Okay, we okay? Next slide, please. So when the project challenges, as I mentioned, scope creep through hidden unforeseen conditions, hazardous material abatement has taken on another level of expense and attention in all kinds of heritage redevelopments right now. And it reared its ugly head during our project, of course. We had asbestos in all kinds of materials and lead paint everywhere. So it introduces a protocol, process, and expense that now has to be considered for all levels of this rehab. Finding the trades, as I mentioned, this is specialty work, and in most cases, there was one trade that can carry off a lot of ours with specific restoration work. And as I mentioned, project funding. I mean, we started this project with inadequate funding, and luckily doubled our grant money as we started work on the project. So it was lucky, and that helped float us through some of our difficult project challenges. Next. This is the main lintel beam over the storefront, and totally concealed in construction. Water leaking. Water is always the enemy. Water got at this, and the bottom, what you see on the left, it's hard to make out, but that's the bottom flange of an I-beam that's entirely corroded, rust-jacked, and delaminated away. So, and at the right, you see the top flange also kind of corroded away, eaten away, and rust-jacking in the brick. By rust-jacking, it kind of refers to the steel expanding, delaminating. Corrosion is 15 times the volume of steel. So when it's embedded in masonry, it just expands and busts up the masonry. Next. So we have to come up with remediation approaches. So we had to kind of back laminate and under laminate this beam and basically stabilize it in place. And you can see what's left of the web of our main lintel support beam over the storefront. Next. Also hidden in the attic, inaccessible because of height and other reasons, was a totally unsupported front parapet, just brick stacked up 6 feet high. Thought it was wood framing because there was no indication otherwise. And this presents an envelope. Well, it presents an envelope seismic problem, and in an earthquake, all of this unsupported brick can fall on people running from the building during a seismic event. So it's a rather expensive exercise to brace it all. We did it all in wood, but it still is a lot of anchorage to sidewalls and a lot of closed concealed area construction, and quite expensive. So this kind of came out of the blue, and thank goodness we had extra funding to kind of manage this. Next. Specialty kind of trades is basically, you know, only one or two sheet metal trades that can pull off an ornamental sheet metal cornice like this. The zinc scroll brackets were actually from the Eastern Seaboard because no one in town can do those. And the arched massive wood moldings you see, they're kind of core of our arched openings. Again, only one entity, Vintage Woodworks in Vancouver and Victoria could manage this. So luckily they're reasonable. They even though they know they're the only ones who can do it, they don't shaft you on pricing. So we managed to kind of get through these things. And also, if you see in the background, there's new windows at the balconies and a whole new storefront below. And we're able to work with local trades, more or less train them up because none of them had really been involved in this level of storefront restoration. And we work through it. So you have to, if you can't find a trade that's readily experienced in this, you essentially wind up training them up. Next. I next want to quickly touch, it's a kind of complicated area, so we can't dig into it too deep, but I just want to touch on these City of Vancouver building bylaw, building upgrade triggers that tend to be a key impediment for a lot of heritage building owners across the city. And of course, it's also the case in Chinatown. If you do a major renovation, which is renovating building systems, or it basically is renovating throughout multi-floors of your building, it pushes you to a major renovation, which is you see on the right side, the fourth stream down. And the S2 is not particularly onerous, but the N3, which is bracing of non-structural, is a real kicker for these heritage buildings because they're typically unreinforced mass masonry. And as I mentioned earlier, you have to develop frames to grab that masonry on the street and other facades that might threaten exits and brace those things back to the building frame. It requires pinning to masonry, back steel frames, and it's pretty expensive, invasive work. And it's once you price it out, it's enough to stop a lot of building owners, just not societies with literally no money in Chinatown, but lots of even deeper pocket building owners to say that's ridiculous. I'm going to stay put and let my building stagnate and just enjoy the revenue that's possible right now, rather than elevating to the building to an upgraded, better state. Next. The next big impediment is if you try to change the use in your building. For instance, on these small buildings, if you change more than one floor plate, for instance, to a different use, you're throwing into this change of major use occupancy flow chart, and the upgrade requirements are more onerous yet. Next. So as I mentioned, the expense in undertaking multi-floor interventions and a major renovation, and worse yet, any kind of change of use, and really to undertake a substantial, meaningful upgrade of a building, you may want to change use. You may want to change use from a underused floor or two of social uses to maybe housing or maybe office that generates revenue, and you're stuck with a crippling building upgrade due to these triggers. And really it's to my current, it's part of my conservation architectural engineering consultancy work. I have plenty of clients who are simply stagnated in their building ownership right now. They can't make meaningful upgrades or push ahead worthwhile upgrade work in their buildings, and it's bad for the buildings, and it's bad for kind of our construction industry in general, because it just means this work is inhibited and doesn't go forward. Next. funding challenges. A lot of the grant money that was available for Chinatown upgrades is dried up. And the last pretty generous round of provincial funding, the SERP COVID response funding, basically locked out most of the urban areas. There was almost no money thrown at the cities. It all kind of filtered out to the rural areas, and this was the objective. Apparently, it didn't really wasn't really explained until everyone got their grants in, because it was quite a bit of effort to get grants in. I worked with 3 or 4 societies to get grants in, and only one was partially successful. 160 East Hastings. Next. So, you know, this was an upgrade component of the Chen Wing Chun's application, which they frankly weren't too anxious to even undertake. They had a falling down fire escape and other more important upgrades, and this is what got funded. So we are pushing this ahead, and of course they're pretty concerned about the budget, and for good reason. So I mean, this is going to go in for permit. We're going to get trade pricing to find out exactly where it goes, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to be working with them out fundraising, trying to find the rest of the money to complete our storefront restoration. Next. So as I said, there's with usually no money on hand and a reluctance to borrow, there is a total reliance on grant funding, and the grant funding is pretty difficult right now. So my recommendation is that the city should work, lobby and work toward levering grant monies from the province and the feds to make this, to start turning around these buildings before they decline to total dilapidation and kind of an unrecoverable state. Next. And just kind of in closing, we do need grant money to kind of make all this work. And I think there should be a sit down with the Vancouver Building Department and explore how we can manage upgrade triggers a little more effectively, so that they are not, in fact, inhibiting upgrades, that we can encourage upgrades to meet kind of improved conditions, improve fire life safety, improve seismic performance, but not to extent that it just stops buildings in their tracks. Next. Okay, but I think as I mentioned, grant money lobbying is core. I haven't been terribly involved in zoning codes. It's just on the periphery, but I think the zoning codes need to be tweaked in Chinatown and Gastown, so that we are not, creating a disturbed kind of street wall with oversized buildings that don't mesh with the current fine urban grain of the heritage buildings. I believe that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much, John. I think you might be muted, John. Sorry,
this is the condition of the 21st century. You're on mute, you're off mute, etc. As much as one is supposed to be aware of these things. No, thank you for that. That was great. It prompted a couple of questions, but I'll save those till later in our discussion stage. But looking at the Chen Wing Chun building, one of the immediate issues right now, which I got a call on, is helping them keep the stained glass dome in the top floor from completely collapsing, because parts of it have fallen out already. And so I'm working with stained glass people to get in there to get that thing stabilized and things.
Right. And that was one of our key areas of our grant application. And so that was kind of the problem, in that some key requirements were passed over, and you know, it's good to get the street wall repaired. I mean, that storefront needed an upgrade. Was incongruent entirely with the facade, but many other building systems needed attention as well. So, and it was typical of all those grant applications for SIRP, and it really fell out of our 2016 work, in that these buildings need attention and quick.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree. And I worked on a couple of grant applications where, again, necessary work, and it didn't receive anything. So, but I'll save the other questions for a bit later on. Our next presenter is Jessica Chen, and I've had the pleasure of working with Jessica in the past. She was with the City of Vancouver for some time. She's now based out of Montreal. I'll just read a brief bit of her bio. Her career focus has been on social inclusion and urban strategies that encourage pluralistic understanding of the cities. Jessica holds a master's degree in city planning from the University of Pennsylvania and started her professional career in the public sector, first in Philadelphia, then in Vancouver, and her 12 years at the city focused on regeneration of historic inner city neighborhoods, tackling the issues of gentrification, heritage conservation, and affordable housing, and social inclusivity. And so she now runs a consulting practice in Montreal, Wabi Sabi Planning, and I'm really pleased to have Jessica present the next piece.
Thank you, John, and glad to be here. Listening to Barry talking about the constraints of working with those society heritage buildings really brought back memories for me. First, working as a planner within the city, trying to changing the system from within. And then later on, work as a consultant with Barry and a few society members. It really shows that the disconnect on how some of the regulatory system set up to protect those old heritage buildings, and then how the process can really be improved. But today I'm here to speak as a community advocate for Montreal's Chinatown. As John mentioned, I have relocated to Montreal from Vancouver more than 8 years ago now. And I have been part of the Chinatown community organizing here in the past 3 years. So I hope to change the gear a little bit and share a bit of my experience and observations here today from Montreal's perspective. So next slide, please. This session is about connecting different forms of heritage and examine new approaches in renewing tangible heritage assets through continued and renewed cultural uses. So first, on the tangible heritage assets, while I'm very passionate about heritage buildings, I would believe it is very important for us to view it from beyond the collection of the heritage buildings. Most of Chinatowns, especially the ones that remain at the original location like Vancouver and Montreal, their histories, current challenges, and future possibilities are all closely tied to the overall city's development and history as we know. Chinatown existed as a place of sanctuary at the time of overt racism and discrimination. Recognition of its heritage status or lack of are all closely tied to the civil rights movement and social justice movement in our country. And its challenges as an old inner city neighborhoods also closely tied to the overall urban planning history in North America. Urban renewal in 1960s and 70s that brought us land expropriation for highways, large social housing projects, or federal building complexes in name of progress. And then we have suburbanization in the 80s when development started to take on a more postmodern approach within these old neighborhoods. Then with the back to city movement, or in Vancouver, living first strategy in downtown, real estate development heat up around Chinatown, gentrification pressures pose the question, who does the neighborhood belong to? Achille Garcia. Now, within the context of reconciliation and cultural redress, I think the question is, what is each city in Canada going to do? And how would Chinatown bear witness to the new chapters to come? At least I hope a new chapter is indeed coming. So Chinatowns are disappearing. In the 1930s, there were about 25 Chinatowns in Canada, now about 12. Quebec City used to have a Chinatown. Now it's gone, erased. with Montreal being the only and last Chinatown left in Quebec, last Francophone Chinatown in North America. Next slide, please. A quick orientation on Montreal's Chinatown. Excuse myself for the graphic. Due to limited time, I quickly put together this map. Located at Totiake, current day Montreal, on the unceded territory of Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, Chinatown has been home to a very diverse range of inhabitants since its settlement. Prior to any Chinese settlement in the area, the place featured a lively and diverse community of working class people, including Jewish, English, Irish, French residents. In 1877, the first Chinese-owned business, a laundry, was opened by Zhou Songlong in the neighborhood at the present-day Saint Antoine Street. Formation, growth, and decline of Montreal's Chinatown actually really mirrors many other Chinatowns. Growth of suburbs like Bourassa in the south shore of Montreal Island with increased Asian population, cluster of Chinese commercial residential activities around Concordia University in downtown Montreal. Such development pattern is really quite similar and familiar for us in Vancouver. From 1960 to 80s, Chinatown was also targeted by a series of urban renewal. Sorry, was I muted? Hello?
Just briefly, but I think you're back now.
Okay, all right. So I just realized I was talking to myself. Okay, so on the map here, you can see the blue dotted line bordering, for folks who are not as familiar with the orientation of Montreal's Chinatown. The map here, you see the blue dotted line bordering south of Chinatown is L'Autoroute-Ville-Marie. This is the highway that actually got built in our city here. To the west of that, you see that blue dot is the big complex Guy Favre. Blocks of Chinatown here, houses and churches, they were all expropriated to build this large federal building complex and housing. South of that blue dot is the purple dot you see there. That is the Palais de Congrès. It's a convention center built in the 1980s, also a large building. East side, another purple dot you see, that were the newer development approaching the major development of Chen Hospital. So Chinatown, with this very unique character and building types, is really boxed in with this really large infrastructure. Now we are also in the middle of discussing this new light rail line, the purple dotted line you see on the map here, that will run along the northern boundary of Chinatown. While we really support more forms of public transit, the fact that this light rail will start to go above ground just around Chinatown area with a new station is really concerning for us. So more than a century, Chinatown has served as the heart of Montreal's Chinese community. It's located just north of the old Montreal. You see on the map here, it is a major heritage site for Montreal where most visitors come to Montreal will go to. But I do see Chinatown's history as part of the Boulevard Saint-Laurent, the main. Along Boulevard Saint-Laurent, you see on the map here, the long gray line there. The main, or it's many refer to the corridor of immigrants. It is in fact a national historic site. Just north of Chinatown is the Quartier des Spectacles. There used to be a red light district. Further up, there's a vibrant Jewish community presence. Further up, Little Portugal, Little Italy. And also this street is where the so-called two solitudes of the Francophone and Anglophone actually come together and mingle. So living together in the city. Basically the main Boulevard Saint-Laurent is really representing how the diverse group of people in the city coming together, live together, vivre ensemble, sharing. And to me, Chinatown is a very important symbol and very important part of that fabric, of that heritage context. In recent years, real estate development started to heat up in Montreal's downtown, and there comes the condo. And you see in the map here, the yellow dot, that is the first of the first development project we noticed. Next slide, please. So when we saw this big giant hole on the ground, right by the south gate of our Chinatown, and we realized that the condos are coming, gentrification pressure is moving in. You see it on the top left corner of the photo. That is actually the new condo project being built right next to the gate. So a few of us in Montreal started to organize. We formed the Chinatown Working Group, the travaille sur le quartier chinois de Montréal in 2019. I was really shocked coming from Vancouver when I learned that Chinatown, in fact, in Montreal has no heritage status and therefore no real recognition or land use protection at all. Given the last slide I was just going through, I kind of feel like this moment is like the highway fight to get the heritage recognition and 105 Kiefer fight, all kind of jumble at the same time. And it's really precarious and extremely exhausting. So we started writing letters to the city in 2019, asking the city to put a temporary moratorium on the development to recognize Chinatown's heritage and to develop a plan for it. We didn't get the moratorium, but the city responded with a community consultation process. So at first, the process was only mandated as some sort of beautification project in some part of Chinatown. So we were actively, strategically participating in that process to hold city accountable, to adjust its mandate on that process to reflect the more complex issues the neighborhood is facing. Luckily, they listened. But then in the middle of the process, the global pandemic happened. It comes with increased anti-Asian racism and additional challenges. But we moved along, and in the end of 2020, city made an official declaration to support Chinatown and recognize its historical significance. I got a lot of messages during that time from people. They were very happy, but totally surprised that Chinatown is actually not a heritage site already. So it just showed that how much we have taken this neighborhood for granted. Just when we were celebrating this little victory of declaration, we found out that the most historic block of Chinatown at de la Gauchetière and Rue Saint-Hubin, the photo left bottom corner here, this block is being assembled by a very large developer group. And this happened in the middle of the city's process that we've been participating, and just months after that declaration of support. So we went public with our effort. We went public with a demand, public outcry, and the outpouring of support from potential community allies really pushed the panic button in the city and as well as in every one of us, wondering whether it's too late. It is hard to bring about very sufficient change to a neighborhood that is neglected for such a long time. But it seems that we are doing it a small step at a time with all these volunteer hours and zero resources for 3 years now. But with persistence, the broader mobilization taking place, the issue seems to be taken more seriously now. The Plan d'Action pour le Quartier Chinois, the Chinatown Action Plan, was finally adopted by the city in July this year. The city has requested the province to designate Chinatown as a heritage site. A tripartite committee with senior reps from the city, from the Ministry of Culture, Heritage Montreal, and community groups, including ourselves, to develop heritage protection recommendations. And last week, we held the first ever municipal election debate in Chinatown to make sure Chinatown issues are taken seriously at the upcoming election, municipal election. And it was a very historical moment and very touching to see. So I'm not sure where and how this will go and whether we are a little bit late, but the process has been very inspiring and the changes are indeed being made. Next slide, please. This organizing experience in the past 3 years, for me, I really experienced Chinatown's intangible heritage in many different ways. Beyond the rich cultural tradition, practice, and production that we all experience is very rich, very strong in Montreal. This vibrant community, there are so many people who care. The history and present culture of this living together, supporting each other, sharing, and also brought out these incredible community allies beyond Chinatown's specific boundary. Sure, how to really work together through differences will be a less linear road ahead, as many of you advocating in Vancouver's Chinatown would know. But I do see that that is the strength and why this place is so special and unique to so many. But for this community to continue thriving and for the renewed cultural uses that Barry was talking about to continue to take place in that space, it really required tangible heritage assets, the heritage building and the overall neighborhood context as a whole to be protected and supported. So I believe the intangible heritage here is actually the reason, the why we are protecting Chinatown. So coming from Vancouver to Montreal to do a kind of the order a bit different for me personally, it really made that very clear to me. Next slide, please. So I would like to end my 10 minutes, maybe I'm a little bit over, with a quick comment on saving Chinatowns in Canada. I think we are at a very unique moment in history that 3 national or even international movements are converging. Racism always existed. Now there's growing willingness, but now there's a growing willingness trying to openly discuss and address this anti-Asian racism in solidarity with other groups that are being oppressed. How we speak the truth to the colonial past, seek genuine reconciliation and cultural redress beyond land acknowledgement and apologies. And the inequality in our society is highlighted through these gentrification processes in many cities that led to the coast-to-coast Chinatowns conservation efforts, both in the United States and Canada. To me, what Saving Chinatown is about is more than saving the old, but really about saving the future or a possibility for new ways of doing things. New ways are never easy and always full of different opinions and disagreements, and that is the nature of it. But as always, I think Chinatowns are there to bear witness and often there to lead the change. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I must admit, the first time I visited Montreal's Chinatown, I was like, what? There wasn't, you know, the visual wasn't there. And coming from Vancouver and Victoria, it was like, huh. But I think on the second or third visit, we went down one evening and we just sat, went to the bakery, sat, had some buns, and just watching the life of the street. And suddenly you could see the neighborhood emerge just by watching. And so the physicality, I think, there is not as important in terms of the architecture than the activity. And that's every time we go back to Montreal, that's one of the things that I quite enjoy is now hitting the bakeries, and there's lots of them, and then just sitting outside and all times of the day and just watching the life of the neighborhood. And I think that's one of the lessons I get from Montreal's Chinatown is, you know, I'm so used to the balcony buildings of Victoria and Vancouver. You go to Montreal and you go, huh? And then you go, oh no, there is a space here, there is a community. And I think that's one of the very important lessons that I've got from Montreal's Chinatown. So thank you, that was great. Now we are very pleased to, and the one person on the panel that I've not met in person before, but very thrilled to have Lo Lin Lee speak to us because her experience is Georgetown in Penang. And so I'm just going to read most of her biography because it's quite extraordinary. She is a graduate of the London School of Economics. She is a lecturer at the University Sans Malaysia, Penang, and then a mid-life career change brought her to historic and architectural conservation and research, and a Duncan Sandys PATA scholar with the Conservation Foundation of Britain, and a senior council member of the Penang Heritage Trust since 1990. She's been a consultant for UNESCO, Beijing for the World Heritage Site of Mountain Lushan in Jiangxi Province, a trainer for UNESCO Specialist Cultural Heritage Guide Course, and a co-conservator of the UNESCO award-winning, and I'll apologize for the pronunciation here, the Chong Fat Se, or Blue Mansion, and an acknowledged authority on interpretation of cultural heritage sites. And there's more, but I think that gives you a really great sense of our next presenter, Lo Lim, and I'm really looking forward to this piece.
Hi, good morning. First of all, apologies. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. First of all, thank you. And then apologies for, it's 2 a.m. in the morning here in Penang. So please excuse any possible slip-ups as we go along. I've been asked to share lessons. Not so much teach them as share the very hard journey that we've had to achieve World Heritage Site status. I'm going to run through these quite quickly. Please, somebody's controlling the slides for me. Can we have a next, please? Hi. Thank you. Interestingly, I've been listening to all the different Chinatowns in North America, and Georgetown and Malacca are actually one of the few twin sites on UNESCO's list, meaning we are actually one site. And anything that happens in one actually affects the other. UNESCO Citation actually calls these the two towns constituting a unique architectural and cultural townscape without parallel anywhere in East and Southeast Asia. If you look on the, here, you can see that the Georgetown site is actually quite large. It's about easily 4 to 5 times the size of the Malacca World Heritage Site. The orange is the core zone, and the buffer is even larger than the core. Over the last, well, we were listed in 2008. Over the last 13 years, we now no longer think about core and buffer as we originally did, where restrictions were a lot stronger in the core. Now, when everybody talks about the World Heritage Site, we forget about the boundaries. We really think about it as one site. Next, please. Okay, the outstanding universal values, the OUVs under which Georgetown was submitted. Originally, of course, as you know, UNESCO had 6, now I think they have 10. The ones that were chosen for Georgetown and Malacca were 2, 3, and 4, an exceptional example of multicultural development, both in town planning and in architecture. Living testimony, much of what we've listened to this morning, to living multiculturalism and religious pluralism, 2 a.m., exceptional range of shophouse and townhouse architecture. Those of you who have been to Penang can testify to this. Those of you who have not, please come and visit us. Next, please. Okay, that's actually a remarkable range. It's actually quite, I mean, you can tell how much of a Penangite I am. The architecture never fails to be jaw-dropping. I mean, if you look at it at a glance, all this is in a small little town area of a small little island. So the varying architecture obviously fulfills the criteria 2 and 4. Next, please. And the variance in the community. We call it a marketplace. It is Malay, Chinese, Indian, Eurasian, and what is often termed as others. I wish I could spend time on this, but quite clearly the 10 minutes is, okay, you all went past 10 minutes, so I'm gonna do a bit of this. Okay, next, please. Food, of course, Penang is world famous for its food. Very quickly, the struggles to get World Heritage listing actually took 11 years. And for Georgetown, the impetus was completely from the bottom up. In Malacca, it was top down. It's always been, historic Malacca, the government wanting recognition for Malacca and its history. For Georgetown, it was a battle. And it was never recognized, and the impetus was from bottom up. The catalytic impacts basically arose from, demolitions that took place without our knowledge, planned destruction by, big-time developers. And these were buildings we had grown up with, and suddenly they were gone. Civil society efforts from the Penang Heritage Trust in particular were very strong, very insistent, and it grew. And then slowly singular high-profile best practice restoration projects actually led the way. I think very, very much so over the years, we've realized that when you have such spectacular and abundant built heritage, living communities tend not to be given great significance. You are so taken by the architecture, you forget that it is the people within the buildings. Even the management plan gives very little urgency or importance to the protection of the intangibles or of the communities. And we are realizing our errors as we go along. Next, please. In the case for the Georgetown World Heritage Site, and in fact, the whole island of Penang, because it's an island, the initial limited land and the increasing development pressures had to be there first. And very often in many other sites in Malaysia, the urgency doesn't happen because they don't have that pressure and that limited amount of land. Here on the island, it was tremendous. So the awareness was very gradual, but it grew. And when we lost community cultural assets, people became increasingly distressed. Civil society groups had to work tirelessly, and we spent a great deal of time just building awareness. And all the time in an Asian developing country, you are trying to achieve balance between conservation and development. There were differing values, differing needs, all of which had to be acknowledged, and community weightage had to be levied whenever it was needed. What has happened most importantly, I think, over the last 20 years is that political awareness has evolved. Politicians now are what we call, they jump on the bandwagon because suddenly voters are interested in conservation. Politicians were never interested in conservation before. So here a very hard lesson is actually using, in those days, it wasn't even social media, it was using the press. You have to get the press on your side. And for some reason, politicians listen to what comes out in newspapers. They believe that, we should fight for whatever people are fighting for, even if we know nothing about it. The political environment now has developed very strongly where any large-scale conservation issue, whether it's built or it's natural, cannot proceed without some semblance of community involvement or consultation. And don't forget, this is Asia. And unlike North America, it's something very rare, something very unusual. Next, please. I show you this example here of what we call the clan jetties. These are historic jetties built around a certain section of the port of Penang, where you had the Chiu jetty, the Tan jetty, the Ong jetty, the Lim jetty. And they originally would have started off being possibly pirates, possibly, moving cargo. They were due for demolition. 7 historic jetties, a highway was planned, and there was no recognition. And they were only identified in 2005 as critical living heritage communities of the so-called intended World Heritage Site. Because they were saved, they are now historic communities with no architecture whatsoever to speak of. I mean, look at them. They're timber, nothing special, and yet a very important and a very integral part of the World Heritage Site. I'm glad to say they're now enjoying the benefits of World Heritage listing. Next, please. So sometimes, we have to think beyond the built heritage. I would like to talk here about cultural capital. What is it? It is the creative expression of a people's existence in the past, near past, and present. Traditions, beliefs, achievements of a site and its people. We all know about our tangible heritage, which, as you know, is movable, example, paintings, or immovable, as in buildings. And we show a few here that, I think everybody's familiar with. They're wonderful. If you haven't been to them, please try to go. Next, please. And quite clearly, intangibles. I just love these pictures. That's why they're there. We have heritage in immaterial form. And the other speakers have mentioned this. We have music and dance and skills. We have beliefs and practices. Next, please. Okay, if we can actually understand cultural capital, then we talk about significance. I believe then that we have taken the first step. Any sustainable conservation decision has to take note of a statement of significance. This has to be made known to all parties so that they understand just what it is that they're supposed to be protecting. This is a statement which indicates why a place is important, what are the values of the place, why are they important to the community and to all groups within that community. Sometimes we presume we know, and we really don't quite get it right. Here I show something called the Penang story. And this was done by the Penang Heritage Trust. And it spanned, 1.5, 2 years. It was called a celebration of cultural diversity. So basically we gleaned from various communities. We got them together and we allowed people to tell their stories from the Indians, from the Chinese, from the Malays, from the Eurasians. And we identified living heritage treasures, the intangible cultural heritage of Penang. These were all documented and they came in they were very useful and very necessary in the submission of the Penang story. Next, please. John mentioned the Chong Fat Sea, and I was asked to mention this. There was a visit to Penang and to the mansion by some of the team members from Vancouver, Chinatown, and I was specifically asked to talk about this. This was seen as a pivotal restoration. It was, I call it an act of faith and a belief in the importance of cultural heritage and cultural capital. I show pictures here of what it looked like. Basically, both my husband and I are involved in this, and the nicest way of putting it is we had no idea what we were doing. It just all seems like we knew, but we really didn't. The UNESCO citation in 2000 actually states, and I'd like to read this, the mansion's restoration has had enormous impact and influence on the preservation movement in Penang by prompting the local government to enact strong preservation measures. It has stimulated restoration and adaptive reuse of structures in its immediate vicinity, and it serves as a model for restoration projects throughout the city of Georgetown and indeed the entire region. This was UNESCO citation, not ours. It's been heartache and it's been joy for the last 30 years. Next, please. We have invested in cultural capital. I show some of these lovely pictures, some of which, you might recognize. Of course, Crazy Rich Asians, that was the most recent. But, more importantly, I think a long time ago, while we were still doing the restoration work, Indochine used it as a location site, and it eventually went and won Best Foreign Movie at the Academy Awards. So it's had great exposure, and it's brought Penang into the forefront and Georgetown as a heritage city. Next, please. Okay, as far as built conservation in Georgetown now, developers are jumping on the bandwagon. They've been jumping on the bandwagon for the last 10 years. They were the biggest, they presented the biggest opposition to the World Heritage listing. They fought it tooth and nail. They're now on the bandwagon. They're buying up property. There's enthusiastic support for conserving built heritage because they have seen what land value, what the escalation has taken place in Georgetown. I see it as the largest escalation of land value anywhere in Malaysia. So, you're looking at simple shop houses, which cost, Malaysian, maybe 300,000 ringgit, which would be about 100,000 US. Well, maybe less, 80,000 US. So now about 3.5 million ringgit. So you're looking at 800,000 US in 10 years. I show some, stunning restoration projects because they actually are used as examples of why you should go about buying heritage properties. And that has then, given rise to now new problems. The Suffolk House here that you see in the middle was probably our most demanding, most challenging project. It was a pile of bricks by the time we got to it. It was even harder than the Blue Mansion to restore, but, totally gratifying. Next, please. Okay, very often we talk about cultural heritage tourism. That's the big question that all politicians, all governments, all civil servants talk about when they want to list a site, they want to get the site recognized. Why? Because of tourism. We're now talking about heritage tourism, cultural heritage tourism. How do you achieve successful cultural heritage tourism? I believe that you start off by assessing what the community needs. You assess tangible and intangible, and quite clearly, people have to be engaged in order to identify their own cultural heritage assets. Beyond the trickle-down benefits, we're always talking about key tourism players. Key tourism players are your big hotels, your tourist guide companies, etc. Everybody else gets only a trickle-down, unless there are tourism policies and specific programs that identify, understand, and conserve cultural assets, leading to economic benefits for the community itself. And what would the outcomes be if you had cultural heritage tourism that was successful? Your built heritage would be inventorized. It would be evaluated. Sorry. Skills, techniques, products that define our core values would then be identified and acknowledged. Visitors, on the other hand, enjoy a multifaceted and value-added experience. The hosts gain improved earnings and surroundings, and a very strong sense of pride and identity will develop through appreciation of their own culture and heritage. And we have found this particularly gratifying with education and school children's programs, where school children have been brought in to act as, for example, heritage guides. They then become, their eyes are open, and they then begin to value what has been around them. Next, please. I want to show spaces as well, which can be revitalized for use of community. Here we show a park in the middle of town, the before and the after. It's now a strong community park, not for tourists, but for the inner city community. I show here how Cheong Fat Si has sustained world-class conservation and revitalization. Even today, this is very recent. 2 weeks ago, the 2021 winner of luxury hotels, which we're very happy about. Next, please. Okay, important issues. I'd like to, leave with some of these issues that we have realized that authenticity and the genuineness and authenticity of the site is very, very important. You have to maintain the spirit of place. And this only happens with a recognition of intangible heritage. Everybody talks of spirit of place, but you have to recognize that spirit of place and manage to somehow retain it with great difficulty. Integrity refers to completeness or intactness of a site. Here you have professional commitment, transparency, and accountability, which we have found to be absolutely crucial in wanting to retain integrity. And the third, often called continuity. Continuity and role of community, where the community are the people who are the custodians. They are the ones who ensure that there's sustainability of the site. Consensus building includes accessibility of that site. It cannot be just for tourists, it must be for the community. There's equity and there's respect in any successful cultural placemaking and in resilience of a site. Next, please. Okay, after 13 years, I'm sorry to be so depressing, but after 13 years as a World Heritage Site, we still have major problems. And we have problems with a sustainable tourism plan, financial plan, professionals, capacity building, both with architects, builders, with well-trained guides, protection of intangible heritage. The management plan has not been fully operationalized. Very little cultural mapping has been undertaken. There's inadequate up-to-date survey data, inadequate identification of buildings and communities. We're only starting now to identify buildings as what we call support zones. The third area. There is in Malaysia, unfortunately, there's total politicizing of cultural diversity and traditions. Those of you familiar with my country will know that. There are no controls over collateral, so there's no branding exercise, so there's no coherence. There is a tendency in developing countries to gentrify and to take shortcuts. There's an inadequate understanding of heritage values by both contractors and designers. And there's a tendency to over-design, to sanitize, and to use generic ideas, regardless of whatever context you're in. Next, please. And I'd like to end off here by putting across a very well-intended message of if you wish to create the context for a well-managed site, then you have to ensure that there's authentic heritage experience. Please maintain visitor profiles and monitor visitor impact. Zoning, which everybody talks about zoning and usage conflicts. The greatest difficulty we have is maintaining residential mixed content and site protection. You have to ensure that there's income generation and there's reinvestment. We try very hard to facilitate consultation, education, and awareness. Facilities have to be well designed. Oh, the big problem we have here. Set limits on land sales to outside investors. Actually, Unesco has a term for this. They call this outsider incursions. It happens in all World Heritage Sites, particularly in developing countries. Outsiders see opportunity. And if your own country does not set limit on land sales, then you find yourself being taken over. And we have to monitor indicators of change and the consequences. And over the last 1.5 years, all World Heritage sites and tourism areas have had to seriously look at jobs and life beyond tourism. I show you 2 pictures here. They look small, but look at pre-COVID and post-COVID. And everyone is now looking at this. We must do without tourism, and we must manage with limited numbers. So this is our opportunity to relook at these areas. Next, please. I'd like to end here with this image of Georgetown, the World Heritage Site. This is all the way up here, all the way to this, to where the high rise starts. And I'd like to urge Vancouver to invest in cultural capital in order to sustain the future of Chinatown, Vancouver. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was fabulous. And I know I missed one of the trips to be able to do that. And I know many of our folks in Chinatown have had the pleasure and experience of visiting Georgetown and Penang. And Henry Yu often brings many of the aspects of his visits there to our discussions around Chinatown and some of the aspects that we could borrow and learn from. And there's many questions I would love to ask you that this brings up. But I think one of the key things is that you can have policy, but if policy is not enacted on, you don't get anywhere. But I'm intrigued that you had the 2 different aspects. One was from the ground up, forcing someone to pay attention, and then the other one where it was the top-down approach. And somewhere, I guess, they must meet in the middle, hopefully, where people take an interest and want to enact something, but with a bit of pressure to make it happen. And that's, I think, one of the struggles Vancouver has, is trying to get, we've got tons of policy, but sometimes getting the action is a bit slow. So thank you so much for that one. Now, our last presenter is Belle Chung, and I'm going to read her brief bio here. Belle is a cultural worker with a focus on policy change and equity. She is a Salzburg Global Fellow whose work focuses on racial equality, equity, cultural heritage, and anti-racism in the arts and culture, urban and cultural planning, and higher education. She's currently working at the City of Vancouver as a cultural planner, and she was formerly with the Chinatown Transformation Team. And she's focusing on policy and project work related to decolonizing colonial cultural policies, area planning, and major arts and cultural infrastructure projects. And as I mentioned, she was part of the Chinatown team, and she's been involved in the establishment of the Chinese Canadian Museum, and also worked with the city's COVID emergency response team. So it's my pleasure to welcome Belle as our last presenter today.
Great, thank you. I have a slide deck, and so I am here today speaking to you as a member of the city's Cultural Services Department. Oh, I think the slides are maybe not displaying correctly. They're showing as quite big on my screen.
Yeah, ditto.
Okay, I'll continue kind of while that is sorted out. And so I currently work on the Cultural Spaces and Infrastructure team, where we work on area planning, rezoning, developments, and major arts and culture projects across the city. My personal background, I'm an immigrant from Hong Kong, and have a background really working in arts and culture, and particularly arts administration and performing arts, and now works mostly in arts and culture and urban planning and policy. And so today I'm really speaking specifically about Culture Shift, which is the city's 10-year culture culture plan and how the priorities and action within the plan are related to some of the key challenges and work facing Chinatown. Culture Shift was approved by Council in 2019, and the implementation of the plan's key priorities and goals really have been underway already for the last 2 or 3 years. The plan emphasizes reconciliation, decolonizing our processes and policies, and really focusing on cultural equity, redress, and accessibility as key goals and priorities, and working towards a more holistic and people-centered way of looking at culture and heritage. And Culture Shift as a whole is one large overarching policy document, but includes 2 very specific plans, Making Space for Arts and Culture, which focuses on cultural spaces and infrastructure, and the Vancouver Music Strategy, which really looks at the music sector in Vancouver, identifies expanded support for music, and particularly funding for Indigenous and equity denied artists and communities. Next slide, please. And so the slide you're looking at really summarizes the 5 strategic directions for culture shifts, and all of which Chinatown really is integrated into in some way. Given time constraints, I'm not going to kind of go through each of them in particular, but I really do want to emphasize that all 5 of these directions in some way really do speak to and highlight all of the different challenges that the other panelists have talked to today. Next slide, please. And so in particular today, I'm really going to focus on making space for arts and culture, which is the cultural infrastructure plan for the city that's part of Culture Shift. We know that Vancouver is facing accelerated development and rapidly rising commercial land values. And of course, Chinatown is no exception. And the city really is facing an imminent loss of affordable spaces for artists to live, work, and share their work. And of course, this includes all aspects of arts and culture. We're not only talking about theaters or music spaces, we're talking very holistically about what arts and culture looks like on the ground. And so making space for arts and culture really optimizes city policies, tools, programs, and investment priorities to secure, enhance, and develop affordable and accessible arts and cultural spaces. It prioritizes collaboration with the community, private sector, other agencies, and levels of government. It looks in depth at the current state of Vancouver's arts and culture spaces and lays out a long-term vision and commitment to address these really acute cultural space challenges. We know that cultural spaces are really important to individual well-being and social connections, but also for city ecosystems. And when we say cultural spaces, we mean spaces that include production, so artist studios, presentation theaters, performance venues, rehearsal spaces, independent retail-focused arts and culture, and also spaces for intangible heritage activities and gatherings. And this context is really important, knowing that culture is the heart of Chinatown. And we know that Chinatown's cultural spaces are important, not only because they represent physical built heritage, it's a very visible and real part of the neighborhood when you're there, but also because these spaces and buildings house and enable the activities, connections, and transmission of culture inside of them. And we know that when we think about Chinatown in this context, you can't separate the spaces and the activities. Next slide, please. And so very, very quickly, the cultural space context across the city. And so we know that there is growth in the culture and creative industries, but that the majority of artists living in Vancouver really do live below the poverty line. In terms of the spaces that we're aware of in the city, it's been mapped at over 3.4 million square feet, but this also recognizes that there are many spaces for arts and culture that we don't know about, and that the highest demand really is for studio and production space, really spaces to create work where artists can also collaborate with each other. And of course, we also know that the arts are really very, very vulnerable to displacement. And of course, this is an issue that Chinatown is also very familiar with. Next slide. I'm actually going to skip this one. If anybody is interested about how the cultural spaces team does our work, please feel free to reach out. But I actually think the key priorities are more important. So next slide, please. And so some of the key goals in making space for arts and culture, these are really the pieces that speak directly to some of the challenges that we're facing in Chinatown. And you'll see a summary on your screen, but I'll go through them very quickly in the next few slides. Next slide, please. And so the first goal in making space for arts and culture is really to support self-determined Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and urban Indigenous spaces. And there are key actions that you're seeing on this slide, but really the goal is to ensure that there is funding and support, not only for the nations to map and identify cultural significance of their lands, but also make sure that we are in a position to provide support for these spaces as the host nations really and urban Indigenous communities really envision those spaces to be. And of course, this includes kind of looking at spaces as social cultural spaces where we're not drawing those boundaries about really what these spaces should be. And in the context of Chinatown, I think this is also a really important point, knowing that the lands that we're on had a history also before Chinatown that has been recognized, I think, through some of the Chinatown work that has taken place, and that it is something that continues to need to be recognized and amplified. Next slide. The second goal, of course, is around cultural heritage, equity, redress, and accessibility. And so in making space for arts and culture, there are very specific actions around supporting cultural heritage and redress in Chinatown, Hogan's Alley, Punjabi Market, Powell Street, and others as we start to really see emphasis from hearing the voices of those different communities across the city now. A key action really will be around using heritage incentives and other mechanisms to support cultural and intangible heritage. We know that there are tools available to us, both from our cultural priorities, but also really the way heritage policies and bylaws and funding programs work, and we want to make sure that those begin to move towards recognizing intangible heritage. And lastly, improving accessibility for artists, workers, and audiences in city spaces. It's where we're starting. The city owns a lot of cultural spaces, and ensuring that this is something that we're able to address in our spaces. And of course, accessibility is also a really important conversation that typically happens around society buildings. And so we know that it does present challenges from a bylaw perspective when we're looking at older heritage buildings as well. Next slide. The third goal is really around reducing barriers. And I think this goal and these actions speak the most to some of the challenges that were addressed today. Of these 4 actions listed, I would say the second and the third ones really are the most pertinent to Chinatown, really supporting artists, groups, and organizations to navigate our regulatory requirements. These include a lot of the zoning challenges and building bylaws that Barry spoke about in ways that really support Chinatown without I guess, putting the character at risk the way Barry had mentioned, and finding ways to do that in support of cultural heritage. There are other key actions around ensuring that we can have more arts and culture events in non-traditional spaces that maybe haven't hosted arts and culture events in the past, as well as making sure that in terms of zoning use, that we're able to simplify that process. For example, if there are different kinds of artists or cultural events or activities, without each of them having to go through that process separately. Next slide. Goal 4, very quickly, expanding tools. And what we mean by tools, really, we're looking at things like participating in area plans to elevate the role of arts and culture. We continue to work with the province on a new tax class, recognizing how the large impact that property tax really has for nonprofits and arts and culture organizations. And then lastly, really supporting nonprofit commercial and industrial space, but also really we're doing some key work towards cultural districts that will really, is desperately needed, I think, to balance some of the development pressures we're facing, but also how we can ensure that space for arts and culture is available and affordable as as these neighborhoods tend to face very rapid development pressure. Next slide. And so goal 5, increase community ownership and support a community land trust. I think some of this work is also very relevant to Chinatown. And each of these key actions are relevant in different ways. Cultural Services has launched an Affordable Spaces Operating Grants program, which allows space operators to provide affordable space to artists and groups who need it, really to enable affordable space by providing more city resources to these space operators. There is work underway for a community-created and community-led cultural land trust. We know that most arts organizations don't own their land or their space, and that it puts them in a very precarious position. Third, expanding partnerships. I don't think this is a foreign idea for Chinatown, but really providing more resources to enable more of these community partnerships. And lastly, we've also launched a $10 million Vancouver Cultural Spaces Fund, where the goal of this fund is really to provide support for projects to organizations who are looking to acquire space. And kind of the fund is really funded through kind of development contributions and really allows us to distribute those funds throughout the city for different arts and culture groups and projects. Next slide, please. And so very quickly, the plan includes 10-year cultural space targets, and many of the cultural spaces in Chinatown, as we continue this work, I think really should be recognized and considered as a part of the cultural spaces that we should be delivering in this city. And so on the left, you'll see the overall targets. We also, we're looking at 4 key areas: growth, so new spaces, housing. We are working with the city's housing department on housing for artists. Preservation, really looking at a policy of no net loss, a goal of not losing any of our cultural spaces to development, which is a pretty tall order, but it's something that we feel is very important. And then lastly, renewal, spaces that the city currently owns, but are in need of upgrades. And on the right, you'll see the priorities really summarized in the plan, all the different kinds of cultural spaces and priorities that we're working towards over the next 10 years. And the spaces come in many different varieties. Some of them are just artist studios, some are cultural heritage spaces. Others are about allowing co-location and the growth of social cultural hubs. And then of course, performance, exhibition, outdoor spaces, that kind of thing. And next slide. I think I have one more. Oh, the image doesn't work. But very lastly, I've talked mostly about space, but the city's cultural services department has also done some grant work. And so most recently launched a new granting program called Communities and Artists Shifting Culture. And really this is a new grant program that combines 2 previous programs. It's meant to support short-term and limited series arts and culture, but a key thing about this grant program really is that it's meant to support any arts and culture focus in any artistic discipline, any phase of the project in all forms. So really, this eligibility, of course, includes cultural heritage alongside many other things such as Indigenous arts and culture, dance, literary arts, media, music, and in all forms, ranging from performances, video, film, media, radio, audio recordings, basically kind of runs the whole gamut. And I think a really key point about this granting program, there's multiple intakes a year, and we've actually just closed the first intake. And really what we're seeing is that almost 100% of the applicants are from equity denied communities. And so while there is still a lot of work to be done, I think on both the space and granting areas, we're starting to see that the integration of cultural heritage has really allowed people to see themselves in the granting programs and the spaces that we're working towards, and that our continued kind of door open and expanding our own understanding of cultural heritage can help us shift the way our processes, our funding, and the way we work towards policies and regulatory tools can really shift. Next slide. Great. And so if there are any questions, I think I've gone through a very dense policy document very quickly, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at either of the emails that you see, and I'm happy to answer any questions about cultural spaces, but really want to emphasize that for Chinatown, we're really looking at the tools and policies to help us actually move towards these established new definitions for culture and heritage. I think Chinatown is really ready to move that past that conversation about what our definitions are. And now we need to look at the city's culture and heritage, our policies and our tools and funding mechanisms together to allow us to holistically address a lot of the challenges that have been brought up today. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much. And as with everyone's presentation, you bring up so many questions that we have not enough time for. But I think it's an interesting conundrum, though, for much of what we value in terms of cultural heritage and just heritage in the city. I guess problems that we have where everyone enters a project with the best of intentions, and then they get sort of sideswiped by a requirement for something that to meet the code, and then you meet that thing, and then you get sideswiped by something else. And nobody seems to be on the same page in terms of collectively viewing something with the idea of making it successful. And I just recently had a project where we 2 years through the process with one side of the city. And then just last week, somebody popped up and said, oh, you have to do this, which negates everything that we just took the time to work out for 2 years. And I think that's one of the key things for Chinatown is how do we actually bring everyone together so that we're all working on the same page, so that Barry's concerns about, I-beams that are corroded and suddenly there's additional funding needed, to simple things like one of the society buildings and a fire alarm, which potentially could trigger and did trigger requests for major upgrades. And how do we bring all that together so that we're all working on the same page, I think is one of the key larger questions, which I don't expect an answer for, but I think that's one of the things that we really need to start focusing on. I'm going to ask permission from folks to just extend our session just ever so slightly, because we do have a couple of questions in here that I think are interesting. One of the questions that we did have was about UNESCO designation and would it help with funding for Chinatown? But if you look at sort of Lo Lin's experience of 11 years to get to the designation and I think the waiting list for Canada's list of projects that are actually on UNESCO's possible list is huge. So I would suspect we need the funding now before we even think about the idea of UNESCO unleashing additional funds. I wanted to ask the question to everybody, the idea, we have policy work and we have the idea of trying to do things, but government versus private capital, because in Vancouver, we seem to rely, a lot of our policy work is about, say, heritage incentives is giving you more if you do something we want. But sometimes the incentive, in fact, destroys the object that we're trying to save. And I'm just wondering whether we actually need to think of Chinatown very differently and actually have much more public support for those necessities of the complexity of structural upgrade and various things like that. Just your thoughts generally on that.
I think this is a question for me.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important question. A lot of the tools identified in making space for arts and culture do rely on density to deliver amenities, services, the resources to fund upgrades, things like that. And I think this will be really key for Chinatown. I don't have, like you said, I don't have an answer, but I do think it is something that sets this area apart from others. We cannot, I mean, the community has spoken and we've heard density is very, it is very dangerous for Chinatown for a myriad of reasons. And we know this, and we've put in, that we've made it so that we've limited the density, but now we have to be able to address how we're going to deliver the services, amenities, things that the community are asking for in different ways. And I think the city has not in the past really typically been set up to operate in that way, but we have an opportunity here with Chinatown. And I think one of the things, there was a question about what we'd like to see in Chinatown in the next 2 or 3 years. And I really think one of the big areas has to be about focusing on heritage policies and how can we enable them so that cultural heritage can access those funds. And also coming up with a way, I think, of really addressing our bylaw challenges, a lot of which Barry spoke about, so that we either have like a framework or guidelines or something to help us interpret this colonial regulatory framework in ways that actually work for heritage buildings. I mean, it's not perfect and it won't be the best answer, but it has to at least mitigate and provide some solutions to help us get there as we work towards like a bigger picture solution.
Well, that was one of the things, and I'll poke Barry on this one, because I think if you don't have someone like Barry shepherding a project through the system that understands the complexity of the system, how do we make the system accessible to folks who quite simply want to make modest improvements to a building? And even that modest improvement can sometimes be a Byzantine and very difficult process. How do we actually make the process work for a very sensitive area like Chinatown, and not, by the very nature of its complexity and inaccessibility, allow the buildings to continue to fall apart and not get the improvements they need? So Barry, what would you like to see on that side of things, apart from a complete reorganization in the entire city?
I think we need these Vancouver building bylaw triggers adjusted to be more site specific and a little bit more attuned to the community's needs, because the way it is right now, it basically applies to the whole city and relegates those with no funds to a state of stagnation and not being able to undertake any work. So I think we just need to sit down with the city to explore ways that we can advance incremental work without triggering significant code upgrades. Not sure how to go about that. And the Vancouver building bylaw, just like the BC building code, is a pretty complex document. And it's generally pretty hard for the public at large to understand it. So I think we're always going to need design and code professionals to kind of step in and help the public, and particularly help these societies, which are a group of seniors, to understand these things. But I think the first thing is to explore ways that we can kind of dilute the requirements but still achieve improvement.
Okay, excellent.
John, may I?
Yeah, please do.
In here a bit. I believe that you first have to actually categorize your buildings. If you actually slowly go through each one and inventorize, and then put a grade on them, and your bylaws would then, assuming that it is a designated site, your bylaws could have different regulations for the site. In Georgetown, for example, change of use, which you mentioned, that there are many, many hoops to jump through when you want to change, use of even one floor or one section. We have here a change of use charge, which is levied on buildings which are outside the site. So if you want to change your residential to commercial, there's a very high price you pay per square foot. But within the World Heritage Site, there are many waivers given for change of use. You still run through, many layers of bureaucracy, but you do your CIS, you do your HIAs, etc. You go before a technical review panel. But at the end of the day, you are not asked to pay for change of use. You are also very often given a waiver for car park contributions within the World Heritage Site. Whereas outside, obviously, you either provide physical car parking or you pay in lieu of physical car parking. So these are many ways that they try and and help you, you know, with your funding. I'm not saying it works every time, but for example, when I talk about categories, there's category 1 where you're not allowed to do anything, category 2, category 3. So you are allowed various levels of increment to your building in terms of, for example, height. So the rear of a shop house, they might allow you 18 feet extension to, you know, the back of the house, as long as the facade is not, you know, interfered with. And still, it's a case-by-case example. But these are some of the ways that the local authorities, the management plan has actually come up with some of these. And, you know, possibly one can think about, they don't actually have money to give you, but they don't charge you for certain things. So that's their way of, you know, helping you to fund your project. Big problems are, of course, with fire regulations. Because, you know, we struggle with that. Everybody struggles with it, particularly with timber buildings where, you know, the Blue Mansion has a unbelievably beautiful timber stair. It has 7 staircases, and 2 are in McFarlane's Scottish Ironworks, but the other 5 are timber. And a public building is not supposed to have a timber staircase. So what do? You know, do you fire rate it? Do you know, that all these problems which crop up as we go along. And, you know, we struggle with it. We still struggle with it. I'm not sure that helps at all.
No, that does actually help, because I think that's one of the things that a lot of talk in our Chinatown has been about. How do you ring fence the neighborhood so that there's maybe special regulations that apply only to Chinatown and assist in that way. I've got so many questions I want to ask you guys, but I can't because we're running out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much for this. It's been quite illuminating. And Lolin, thank you so much for staying up way too late to participate. I really, really appreciate it. And to everyone, thank you so much. Those presentations were quite illuminating. I just hope we schedule something now so we just have a longer conversation just between all of us about all of the issues that everyone's districts have. But I just want to say thank you so much. It's been great. I've learned a few things this morning as well. So from Montreal, from Penang, Vancouver, thank you everybody for participating.
And John, thank you for your fine moderation.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.